Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's an absolute thrill to be here. I'm absolutely delighted. I want to call out one person who wasn't called out, who is Carl Spadoni over here, who 5 years ago wrote to me and asked if I would consider donating my archives to this institution. Carl is now retired from McMaster, but he joins us back here tonight. None of this would have happened if Carl hadn't taken that initiative 5 years ago. And thank you, Carl. Thank you for making it all possible. I had overtures from other institutions, the University of South Florida, University of California, Riverside, the Merrill Collection here of the Toronto Public Libraries, and of course my alma mater, Ryerson. And I chose this institution. I have no connection with it. I had never gone here. I've never taught here. But when Carl approached me, he said he wanted me for their holdings in Canadian literature. Everybody else had asked for me as part of their holdings within science fiction. And it made me think about my legacy. And I will say I was thinking very strongly about the University of South Florida because its initials are USF, and it's like the University of Science Fiction. But I asked a friend of mine who's a librarian in Miami, at University of Miami, if I should give these papers to the University of South Florida. And she looked at me and said, "Are you out of your mind? You want to give your archives to something that's going to be underwater in 20 years? So McMaster won out for practical as well as patriotic reasons. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight and have my great colleague Robert Charles Wilson and Elizabeth Vonnerberg here as fellow writers, John Robert Colombo, who front and center, this piece right here from 1982, John edited as part of introducing myself and Terence M. Green and Andrew Weiner to a wider audience in Canada. As many of you know, John edited the first ever anthology of Canadian science fiction and many since, and I'm just thrilled that he's here. My editor for 10 years at Tor Books, David G. Hartwell, not only my editor, but the editor of a great number of Canadian science fiction writers is here. And Julie Cherneda, one of our other guests of honor, is dealing with a family issue tonight, but will be here later in the weekend. And I worked years ago, 1982, summer of 82, I worked at Bacca Books in Toronto, now Bacca Phoenix Books. And I was paid $4.25 an hour, which I remember vividly because I argued with the owner at the time about that extra 25 cents because minimum wage was $4 at the time. And I didn't want to work for minimum wage. However, at the end of the summer, I'd spent every penny I'd made buying books at the store. But it has turned out to be economically the best job I ever had because 31 years later, I still get the employee discount. And so I have saved thousands by being associated with Bacca. And Chris Zago, right here in the front row, the manager of Bacca, is our bookseller guest of honor. And I think I mentioned all the all the special guests who are present tonight. So let me get into the talk. And it's going to take me 40 minutes or so to get through this material. I hope you will find it interesting. I will have a sip of water before I begin. But I am absolutely thrilled to be here. And just delighted by this turnout and by the hard work that Kathy and Nicholas did putting this together. I was on a panel earlier this month at DragonCon in Atlanta, in which the moderator opined that science fiction had a lousy track record of correctly predicting the future. I pointed out that you can't publicly predict the future without affecting how the future will turn out. By putting our speculations on the table, we science fiction writers change the course of tomorrow. It's like the observer effect in quantum mechanics. The act of making an observation about the future changes what the future will be. That said, how is it that we SF writers decide what form our fictional futures will take? It's all down to a process called extrapolation. To extrapolate, according to the American Heritage English Dictionary, is to infer or estimate by extending or projecting known information. Science fiction is the only area of fiction in which this is routinely done, and in all of literature, fiction and nonfiction, it's the only field in which it's regularly done on long time scales and with such rigor. Let's begin by defining science fiction. The term was coined by Hugo Gernsback, a Luxembourger who immigrated to the United States and founded the first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, in 1926. Actually, his first stab at naming the field was the portmanteau word scientifiction, all run together, scientifiction. Fortunately, that didn't catch on. In any event, Gernsback's definition was that science fiction was fiction about science. Please note that it never was and is not today about fictional science. We do not just make this stuff up. When a benighted newscaster or columnist says that something improbable is just science fiction, what he or she really means is that it's just fantasy. Science fiction is about things that probably could happen. Fantasy is about things that never could happen. Magic and the supernatural have no basis in reality. We'll refer repeatedly to Arthur C. Clarke, who is my all-time favorite science fiction writer, even if he did make a glaring mistake. In 1965, he coined what's come to be known as Clarke's third law, and it goes like this, and those of you who know it can recite it with me. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's flat out wrong. Magic involves the violation of the laws of physics, most often the law of conservation of mass and energy. There are constraints on what even the most advanced technology can do, and good science fiction acknowledges and works within those constraints. I have coined two definitions of science fiction myself. The first is the one that Kathy and Nicholas and I relied upon in deciding what shape this conference would take, and it was alluded to in the opening remarks. Science fiction is the literature of intriguing juxtapositions. That is, it is the field in which you can find quantum computing and paleoanthropology cheek by jowl, as in my own novel Hominids, or where information theory, Chinese politics, and primate communications, plus the story of Helen Keller, can all spark off each other, as in my novel Wake. More germane to a discussion of prediction is my other definition. Science fiction is the mainstream literature of a plausible alternative reality. Science fiction is the mainstream literature of a plausible alternative reality. Mainstream in the sense that it's told as if to someone already familiar with the milieu of the story. If the story is set on Mars in the year 2087, the writer spins the tale as if the reader lives in 2087, and if he or she doesn't happen to be a denizen of Mars, it's no more exotic a locale to him or her than, say, Madagascar is to us. Another of my criteria, an alternative reality, is designed to include not just the future, but alternate presents and pasts. This includes the field of counterfactual history, exploring scenarios such as the Axis triumphing in World War II, as exemplified by Philip K. Dick's 1962 masterpiece, The Man in the High Castle. Such stories are widely regarded as a subset of science fiction, and for two good reasons. First, the central notion of alternative realities is given scientific validity by the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Second, the same extrapolative skill used in traditional SF is required in writing them. The only difference is that the point being extrapolated forward from is in the past rather than the present. In Gernsback's definition and my own, the constant is plausibility. Science is the empirical, the verifiable, the falsifiable. Science fiction accepts the scientific method as the only legitimate way of knowing. You won't find a more skeptical bunch about mental powers, past lives, UFOs, or New Age nonsense than science fiction writers. A flat-out rejection of the supernatural or the implausible is only one of the fundamental building blocks for science fiction. The other foundational block is the core truth that science fiction espouses. Mainstream fiction, also known as mimetic fiction because it imitates real life, takes as a given that you can't change human nature. Science fiction takes as a given that you can. Yes, there are mainstream works that argue for attitudinal shifts. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a classic example. But such shifts are predicated on appealing to existing, immutable human physiology and psychology. In Harriet Beecher Stowe's abolitionist novel, the appeal was to existing human compassion. It wasn't based on the assumption that a new capacity, namely one for empathy, could be developed in human beings where none had existed before. Charles Darwin understood that humanity is a work in progress. Science fiction writers have stood on Darwin's shoulders all the way back to H.G. Wells. The example of physical change from Wells' oeuvre that first springs to mind is from his 1895 novella, The Time Machine, in which 800,000 years in the future, humanity has bifurcated into two species, the brutal but clever Morlocks and the feckless, feeble-minded Eloi. But much more interesting in this regard is my favorite Wells novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau, published the following year in 1896, because in it change isn't something that happened to humanity, rather change is something done with deliberation by humans. Dr. Moreau creates chimera beings, infusing animals with human traits, or perhaps vice versa, producing creatures that think and feel fundamentally differently from us. And of course, Aldous Huxley gave us one of our first tastes of genetic engineering, creating new kinds of humanity with his various casts grown in glass containers in his 1932 novel Brave New World. And building on that, science fiction has long posited that fundamental human attitudes and mental capacities can and will change. The more science fiction tries to portray the future of humanity as a changed species, though, the harder it is for an untrained, present-day audience to identify with it. As critic Samuel R. Delany has rightly pointed out, reading serious science fiction is hard work. And with science fiction currently predicting everything, including profound body modification, people with gills or extra arms or bigger brains or sonar or what have you, radical life extension, providing practical immortality, the boosting of mental powers and the addition of new senses, scanning consciousness and uploading it into a virtual computer or world or downloading it into durable android bodies, and even the fusing of individual human consciousnesses into hive minds. The task of making modern science fiction accessible to the general reading public is daunting. One of the most influential papers in modern philosophy is Thomas Nagel's 1974, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, in which he argued that it's impossible for beings like us, without sonar and without the ability to fly, to understand at all what those things would be like for beings that possess them. Another paper, Helen Keller's Cognitive Scientist, published in 1996 by Justin Lieber, likewise argued that it is impossible for us as sighted, linguistic beings to comprehend the thoughts of young Helen Keller in her blind, pre-linguistic state. That paper struck me as a challenge and led directly to my WWW trilogy about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness. Still, no matter how hard it is to portray this notion that human beings and their social structures are not static, but rather can and will change radically, is central to science fiction. And that's the first thing you need when trying to extrapolate what plausibly might happen. The conviction that human nature does change, that our psyches and our societies are malleable. Indeed, it is this ability to change that may explain why we're here and all the other forms of humanity have died out. Despite having bigger brains than us, Neanderthals were intellectually stagnant, making essentially the same tools, the Mousterian industry, for almost 200,000 years. Our kind of humanity, however, was constantly improving its technology because our way of looking at the world was constantly changing. Linnaeus takes a lot of flack for hubristically naming us Homo sapiens, man of wisdom, people of wisdom. But if wisdom is the result of cumulatively changing perceptions and perspectives, then perhaps our nimble kind does deserve that name. And accepting that human nature does change, after accepting that human nature does change, the second thing you need to extrapolate the future is, perhaps ironically, a keen appreciation of history. I had the pleasure of interviewing American science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson in 1989 for a documentary series I was writing for CBC Radio. He made the point that the only way to extrapolate a trend is to look not just at the present, but the past as well. The future is just the continuation of history. I agree with Stan Robinson and would add that it's the vector from past to present that gives directionality to our extrapolations. The plausible future is the one that continues past trends. Implausible futures break off in new directions without sufficient cause. In fact, the standard story-generating template for science fiction is not, as many contend, simply asking, what if? That is, merely having a neat idea and working out its consequences, but rather wondering what will happen if this, whatever this happens to be, goes on, projecting a trend to a logical extreme or natural endpoint. The third requirement for effective extrapolation is a recognition that the rate of change is no longer linear, but rather exponential. That's a notion that's been popularized widely by inventor Ray Kurzweil, including in his massive tome, The Singularity is Near. But the idea actually originated with a science fiction writer, Vernor Vinge. The notion of the singularity is wrapped up in the idea that the rate of technological progress is accelerating. The classic example, of course, is Moore's Law, coined in 1965, the same year Clark coined his law, by Gordon Moore of Intel, and usually formulated these days to say that computing power doubles every 18 months. That means the computers we had 10 years ago were only 1/128th as powerful as the ones we have today, and the ones we'll have 10 years from now will be 128 times as powerful as our current best machines. Vernor Vinge told us the singularity, the moment when machine intelligence will exceed human intelligence, would arrive no sooner than 2005 and no later than 2030. A prediction, although 20 years old now, that still seems reasonable. And at the moment it does arrive, a gigantic whoosh will occur, since thinking machines will be able to quickly engineer better thinking machines. Very rapidly, perhaps in a matter of days or hours, humanity will be left far behind. Or at least that's what the singularitarians would have us believe. Regardless of whether they're right or not, the key point that the rate of technological advancement is accelerating is one that must be grasped by anyone extrapolating the future. The amount of progress this decade will be much greater than in the last decade. The progress made this century will far outstrip that of the last century. And this is the century in which the human race will either go extinct or establish its stability for not just centuries, but millennia to come. AIDS and cancer are tractable scientific problems. We lament our slow progress in conquering them, but we've only known the structure of DNA for 50 years now, and we've only had a map of the human genome for 10. Also, we finally have computers powerful enough to deal with complex matters, such as protein folding. In other words, we finally have the tools, after 40,000 years of civilization, to do real medicine. We just got them, but the progress will be rapid. I'll be astonished if by the 100th anniversary of Crick and Watson's discovery of the structure of DNA, that any diseases continue to be a serious threat to humanity. And it's not just technological devices that are changing at an accelerating rate. Rather, it is indeed humanity itself. The changes in the last 50 years, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the general decline in violence, the fact that a smaller percentage of the human race is in armed conflict than ever before, the acceptance in Europe and the growing acceptance in North America that atheists can have a role in public life, the legal recognition in many jurisdictions of same-sex marriages, the growth of women's rights, the recognition of the injustices that have been done to Aboriginal peoples, the end of colonialism, the end of segregation in the US and South Africa, and the fact that the United Kingdom and Canada have had female prime ministers, and that the United States and South Africa have had black presidents, all attest to the rapidity of societal change. And even more change will come in the next 50 years than we experienced in the previous half century. To see some of the extrapolable failings in this area, let's turn to the poor stepchild of science fiction prose, SF film and television. What we in the business call media sci-fi. Such fare represents a different realm with different roots, and most of the good things that can be said about science fiction as an extrapolative genre only apply to written SF. One of my favorite examples of the failing of science fiction films to recognize the increasing rate of technological and societal change is at the beginning of what is otherwise regarded as one of the best SF films of the 20th century, Forbidden Planet, which starred Canadian actors Leslie Nielsen and Walter Pitchett. Forbidden Planet was released in 1956, one year before the launch of the first Sputnik, 5 years before Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth, and just 13 years before we landed on the moon. But it begins with this notice: in the final decade of the 21st century, men and women in rocket ships landed on the moon. Sitting in the mid-1950s and looking at how long it had taken us to get from steam engines to a car in every driveway, 150 years, it seemed likely that the moon was that far in our future if you assumed a steady rate of technological change. Our first three requirements for extrapolating were: 1, a recognition that human nature and human societies do change; 2, an appreciation of history, of what has gone before; and 3, an understanding that the rate of change is accelerating. The fourth thing a good extrapolator must remember is the dictum from the greatest American science fiction editor, John W. Campbell Jr., who said, "The future doesn't happen one at a time." A case in point is what I consider to be the finest science fiction film of all time, 2001, A Space Odyssey, made in the UK and released in 1968. Its screenplay was written by Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, who also directed the film. Now, I'm the first to admit that 2001 made a few enormous blunders in its attempts to extrapolate technology 3.5 decades ahead, and I'll come to the reason for that failing later. But its greatest failing was, perhaps, in the area of societal extrapolation. That is, Kubrick and Clarke thought only technology would change. And so 2001 depicted an all-white future. Not a single person of color appears in that movie. Indeed, so little thought was given to the international nature of the future that one of the first things you see after the first line of dialogue is spoken, 37 minutes into the film, is a futuristic immigration computer that asks you to choose your native language from a list presented in English, offering English, German, French, Spanish, and so on, instead of English, Deutsch, Francais, Espagnol. The second major mistake was failing to acknowledge the increasing prominence of women. By the time the film was made, there had already been a woman in space, the cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova. Not only that, but when 2001 A Space Odyssey came out in 1968, Star Trek, with its multiracial crew, including Lieutenant Uhura and many other females, had been on the air for 2 years. The third major mistake 2001 made was thinking the Cold War would endure into the 21st century. And the fourth major mistake, and this was one that almost no science fiction writer got right, was the belief that humanity would continue its ever outward expansion into space. By the time of the movie 2001, we were to have had giant wheeled orbiting space stations, a city on the moon, and crewed, that is manned, interplanetary missions. Instead, just 3.5 years after the first person walked on the moon, the last person to do so did so. One can almost have sympathy with moon landing deniers who marvel at the notion that we could have done in the 1960s something we can't do in the 20-teens. I was lucky enough to have dinner with Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, a couple of years ago. He'd been lobbying for commercial airlines to let astronauts into their airport lounges for free. And he'd been getting some pushback. The airlines were saying there were just too many damn astronauts these days. Buzz countered that the perks should then be limited to, and this is his phrase, real astronauts. The ones who had undergone TLI, translunar injection. That is, the ones who had left orbit to voyage to another world, of which there were precisely 24, the crews of Apollos 8 and Apollos 11 through 17. No one has undergone translunar injection, and indeed no one has gone more than 500 kilometers from Earth since 1972, just 4 years after 2001: A Space Odyssey debuted. The mistake Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick made was the mistake almost every science fiction writer had made. They'd assumed the whole human race shared their agenda, an agenda that basically said price was no object. But of course, price was and is. I contend that 1,000 years from now, if you look up science fiction in the Encyclopedia Galactica, the entry will begin a 20th century American literary genre. No one in the 19th century dreamed of such profligate spending as depicted in the movie 2001, nor can anyone in the 21st century. Indeed, although Thomas Carlyle dubbed economics the dismal science in 1849, it was one area of extrapolation mostly ignored by science fiction writers for a very long time. Today, though, I'm pleased to announce that it's at the core of many fine works of extrapolation, including the Unincorporated series, edited by David Hartwell and authored by my friends, the brothers Donnie and Eitan Cullen. Of course, it's possible to take extrapolation too far. Consider Isaac Asimov's magnum opus, the Foundation Trilogy, the series that has confounded librarians and readers since its publication because the title of the third book in the series is Second Foundation. The Foundation Trilogy tells of Harry Seldon, a social scientist and mathematician who has developed a field he calls psychohistory, which predicts social trends over not just months or years, but millennia. Asimov's position was that when the human population gets big enough, no one person can have a significant impact, and so the laws of mass action will apply, letting the broad strokes be mapped out over time. By the time of his story, there are quadrillions of human beings scattered over thousands of worlds. Unfortunately, Harry Seldon's psychohistorical analysis predicts that the vast galactic empire is about to fall and a dark age of 30,000 years duration will ensue. He sets out, more or less negating Asimov's premise that one person can't make a difference, to ensure that a new prosperous civilization will arise after the interregnum. The problem, of course, is that Asimov started writing Foundation in around 1940, decades before the notion of chaos theory and sensitive dependence to initial conditions had been developed. We know now that even a slight change has gigantic effects. Rather than being damped out, it can alter everything. This is one case in which media science fiction actually got it more correct. The final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation is called All Good Things, and in it the omnipotent Q takes Captain Picard back 4 billion years to observe the primordial ooze on the young Earth. As he says, if he were to merely stir that ooze with his finger, humanity would never come into being. I took 2001: A Space Odyssey to task earlier for some of its extrapolative failings. But of course, it also had many resounding successes. Something very similar to the tablet computers we all use today was shown in this film, made in 1968. A flat screen device that could display any content. The name was even close to what the real product ended up being called, Newspad instead of iPad. The only thing they got wrong is that in the film, you can clearly see that the manufacturer of this wonderful device was IBM. Apparently, Big Blue didn't have the foresight to actually try to make the devices portrayed in the movie, seeding one of the biggest technological booms of recent years to a rival. The most significant creation in 2001, though, is the HAL 9000 computer, voiced by that wonderful Canadian actor, Douglas Rain. The name HAL was said to be a contraction of heuristically programmed algorithmic computer. However, it's also true that HAL is one step alphabetically ahead of IBM. Arthur C. Clarke denied that this was deliberate. I never used to believe him. The odds are hugely against it, coming up by accident. But my own first novel, Golden Fleece, published in 1990, is very much a homage to 2001, and it features a central computer named Jason, which someone pointed out to me could be rendered not only as JASON, but also as JCN. and the letters J, C, N come one letter alphabetically after IBM. Anyway, in the movie 2001, Hal says his birthday was the 12th of January, 1992. For the novel, which was published after the movie was in theaters, Arthur C. Clarke changed the date to the 12th of January, 1997, 5 years later. To commemorate that date, 12th of January 1997, in real life, MIT Press published a lovely volume entitled Hal's Legacy, 2001's Computer as Dream and Reality. The book has contributions from or interviews with such seminal computing figures as Marvin Minsky, Ray Kurzweil, and Douglas Lynott, as well as cognitive scientist Daniel C. Dennett. The papers in the book make the case that the whole agenda of the computer science and artificial intelligence communities was set from 1968 for the next 30 years by the vision people saw in the movie 2001. And indeed, it was. In 2001, Hal beats a human at chess, exhibits speech recognition, exhibits natural language processing, and has very sophisticated vision, including the ability, as we famously remember, to read lips. He also shows a remarkable talent for facial recognition, not only recognizing real people, but recognizing others in sketches done by an amateur artist. And he even seems to exhibit common sense and moral reasoning. Arthur C. Clarke's famous peer, of course, was Isaac Asimov, whose name is indelibly associated with robots, thanks to his fictional 3 laws of robotics. Those laws, as Asimov himself told me in 1985, and I see some of our correspondences at the upper right of the case here, those laws, as Asimov himself told me in 1985 CBC interview, were actually coined by the great editor of Astounding Stories I mentioned previously, John W. Campbell Jr. So it's no surprise to find that Asimov himself didn't really understand computers. Back in 1952, his attention was caught by UNIVAC, the computer that correctly predicted that Dwight Eisenhower would beat Adlai Stevenson in the race for the White House, when all the traditional pollsters predicted Stevenson would win. The name UNIVAC is a contraction for Universal Automatic Computer. But Asimov figured it was a computer with one vacuum tube, and so decided that his futuristic fictional computer, in his 1956 story, The Last Question, would outdo it by having lots of vacuum tubes, leading him to dub his thinking machine Multivac. Multivac was never networked. It was a single giant physical entity, tended by hundreds of technicians, and if you wanted to ask it a question, you had to go to it. And speaking of networks, it's a silly canard, of course, that Al Gore invented the internet, or claimed to have invented the internet. Of course, he never said that. It's an equally silly claim, although one that's often heard, that science fiction failed to predict the internet. In fact, it did so repeatedly. The oldest reference to something like the internet was probably Mark Twain's Electroscope, which was described in an 1898 short story by him, Leslie. The improved limitless distance telephone was presently introduced, and the daily doings of the globe made visible to everybody, and audibly discussable too, by witnesses separated by any number of leagues. Something even closer to our modern internet, and the World Wide Web that supervenes upon it, was put forth in Murray Leinster's short story, A Logic Named Joe, first published in 1946. When Leinster published his story, the word computer referred to a person who worked with a calculating machine. It was the name of the operator rather than the device. And so he needed a term for the actual machines, and he came up with logics, which is pretty good. And for calling this particular logic Joe, well, is that any sillier a name than Google? In any event, Leinster predicts massively interlinked computers providing answers to questions on any subject at any time from anywhere. His narrator, an aw shucks repairman, describes technology eerily reminiscent of what we now rely on 2/3 of a century later. You know the logic setup. You got a logic in your house. It looks like a vision receiver used to, only it's got keys instead of dials, and you punch the keys for what you want to get. Say you punch, quote, station snafu, quote, on your logic. Relays in the tank take over, and whatever vision program snafu is telecast and comes on your logic screen. Or you punch quote, Sally Hancock's phone. And the screen blanks and sputters, and you're hooked up with the logic in her house, and if somebody answers, you got a vision phone connection. But besides that, if you punch for the weather forecast, or who won today's race at Halea, or who was the mistress of the White House during Garfield's administration, or what is PDQ&R selling for today, that comes up on the screen too. Everything you want to know or see or hear, you punch for it and you get it. 1940s. And let us get back to Arthur C. Clarke's novel version of 2001: A Space Odyssey. In that book, he has one of his characters using the newspad I described earlier thus. When he tired of official reports and memoranda and minutes, he would plug his full-sized newspad into the ship's information circuit and scan the latest reports from Earth. In a few milliseconds, he could see the headlines of any newspaper he pleased. One could spend an entire lifetime doing nothing but absorbing the ever-changing flow of information. So in other words, science fiction even predicted that surfing the web could become an enormous time sink. Now remember what I said about the Foundation trilogy earlier. Isaac Asimov had failed to take into account, because it hadn't been invented yet, the notion of chaos theory, which meant any prediction might go awry thanks to ignored, seemingly small effects. Although the most famous science fictional prose treatment of computing is William Gibson's 1984 novel Neuromancer, is it any wonder that it doesn't accord with how reality turned out, given that Gibson wrote it on a manual typewriter? I've sometimes said in interviews that my recent novel Wake and its sequels Watch and Wonder are in dialogue with Neuromancer, but where Gibson's view is pessimistic and closed, a hacker underground and or big corporations controlling everything, mine is optimistic and open. Power devolves to all individuals everywhere. Gibson's take, fascinating when he first put it forth, has been superseded by reality. The whole cyberpunk fork of science fiction is now a kind of alternate history, unrelated to how computing really evolved. Instead of cyberpunks, we got the communal Wikipedia, and Time magazine naming you, us, the average Joe who freely and altruistically creates online content, its 2006 Person of the Year. The difference between Gibson's approach and mine is driven home most directly in Wake, where I paraphrase the opening line of Neuromancer, the anaphydal clause that turns its meaning around. Neuromancer begins, "The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel," by which he meant to imply a gray, foreboding firmament. But technology changed in ways he didn't anticipate. In my novel, I write, "The sky above the island was the color of television tuned to a dead channel," which is to say it was a bright, cheery blue. Neuromancer, of course, is a remarkable achievement, but Wake came out 25 years later and starts extrapolating forward from a reality in which the World Wide Web actually exists. Still, Bill Gibson and I are in accord on some things. As I argued in a 1999 speech at the Library of Congress, the central message of science fiction is this: look with a skeptical eye at new technologies. Or, as Gibson has put it, the job of the science fiction writer is to be profoundly ambivalent about changes in technology. We SF writers have an essential societal role, one being fulfilled by no one else. Actual scientists are constrained in what they can say. Even those scientists lucky enough to have tenure, which supposedly ensures the right to pursue any line of inquiry, are in fact muzzled at the most fundamental economic level. They cannot speculate openly about the potential downsides of their work because they rely on government grants or private sector consulting contracts. The government is answerable to an often irrational public. If a scientist is dependent on government grants, those grants can easily disappear. And if he or she is employed in the private sector, well, then certainly Samsung doesn't want you to say cellular phones might cause brain cancer. Dow Chemical didn't want anyone to say that silicone implants might cause autoimmune problems. Philip Morris didn't want anyone to say that nicotine might be addictive. Granted, not all of these potential dangers turned out to be real, but even considering them, putting them on the table for discussion, was not part of the corporate game plan. Indeed, suppressing possible negatives is key to how all businesses, including those built on science and technology, work. There are moments, increasingly frequent moments, during which the media reports that, here's my Walter Cronkite, science fiction has become science fact. Certainly one of the most dramatic recent ones happened, well, actually it's not all that recent now, 15 years ago. Ian Wilmot at the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh had succeeded in taking an adult mammalian cell and producing an exact genetic duplicate, the cloning of the sheep Dolly. Dr. Wilmot was interviewed all over the world, and of course, every reporter asked him about the significance of his work, the ramifications, the effects it would have on family life, and so on. And his response was doggedly the same, time and time again. Cloning, he said, had narrow applications in the field of animal husbandry. That was all he could say. He couldn't answer the question directly. He couldn't tell reporters that it was now technically possible for a man who was 35 years old, who had been drinking too much and smoking and never exercising, a man who had been warned by his doctor that his heart and lungs and liver would all give out by the time he was in his early 50s, to now order up an exact genetic duplicate of himself. A duplicate by the time he needed all those replacement parts would be 16 or 17 years old, with pristine, youthful versions of the very organs that needed replacing. Replacements that could be transplanted with zero chance of tissue rejection. Why, the man who needed these organs wouldn't even have to go to any particular expense. Just have the clone of himself created, put the clone up for adoption, possibly even an illegal adoption in which the adopting parent pays money for the child, a common enough, if unsavory practice, letting the man recover the costs of the cloning procedure. Then let the adoptive parents raise the child with their money, and when it comes time to harvest the organs, just track down the teenager and kidnap him and, well, you get the picture. Just another newspaper report of a missing kid. Far-fetched? Not that I can see. Indeed, there may be children out there right now who, unbeknownst to themselves or their guardians, are clones of the wonderkins of Silicon Valley or the lions of Wall Street. Still, the man who cloned Dolly couldn't speculate on this possibility or any of the dozens of other scenarios that immediately come to mind. He couldn't speculate because if he did, he'd be putting his future funding at risk. His continued ability to do research depended directly on him keeping his mouth shut. He had to restrain, not encourage, extrapolative leaps. Also, we science fiction writers aren't bound by non-disclosure agreements the way so many commercial and governmental scientists are. Because of that, we were the first to weigh in on the dangers of nuclear power, as in Lester Del Rey's 1942 story, Nerves. And we began the public discourse about the actual effects of nuclear weapons, as in Judith Merrill's 1948 story, That Only a Mother, which deals with gene damage caused by radiation. Science fiction is the WikiLeaks of science, getting word out to the public about what cutting-edge research really means. And we come with the credentials to do this work. Many science fiction writers, such as Gregory Benford, are working scientists. Many others, such as Joe Haldeman, have advanced degrees in science. Still others, such as myself, have backgrounds in science and technology journalism. Our recent works have tackled such issues as the management of global climate change, as in Kim Stanley Robinson's 40 Signs of Rain and its sequels, biological terrorism, as in Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, and the privacy of online information and China's attempts to control its citizens' access to the World Wide Web, as in My Own Wake and its sequels. And although one can't imagine George Lucas being asked to advise the space program, print science fiction writers often do consulting for government bodies. A group of SF writers called Sigma frequently advises the U.S. Department of Homeland Security about technology issues. And Stephen Baxter, Alan Steele, and I were recently consulted by DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, about future spaceship designs. Why do they come to us? Because someone needs to openly do the speculation, to weigh the consequences, to consider the ramifications, someone who is immune to economic pressures. And that someone is the science fiction writer. Although, as I mentioned, Isaac Asimov is most famous for the 3 laws of robotics, in 1974, he coined his 3 laws of futurics, and they define well the science fiction approach to extrapolation. The laws of futurics are: 1, what is happening will continue to happen. 2, Consider the obvious seriously, for few people will see it. And 3, consider the consequences. However, we science fiction writers don't just consider the obvious consequences. Our job is not to see just the first-order effects, but the second and third-order effects as well. Anyone could have predicted the automobile, but only a science fiction writer would have predicted the traffic jam. Anyone could have predicted the airplane, but only a science fiction writer would have predicted hijacking, frequent flyer miles, and airport lounges, and Buzz Aldrin trying to get astronauts into them. This sort of extrapolation to second and third order effects goes right back to the very beginning of the genre. Brian Aldiss and many other critics contend that the first science fiction work was Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It explores, in scientific terms, the notion of synthetic life. Dr. Victor Frankenstein studies the chemical breakdown and putrefaction that occurs after death so he can reverse it to animate non-living matter. Take out his scientific training and his scientific research and his scientific theory, and for the first time in the history of fiction, there's no story left. Like so many other works of SF that followed, Shelley's story is a cautionary tale. It raises profound questions about who should have the right to create living things and what responsibility the creators should have to their creations and to society. Think about that. Mary Shelley put these questions on the table almost 2 centuries ago, 41 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species, and 135 years before Crick and Watson figured out the structure of DNA. Is it any wonder that Alvin Toffler, one of the first futurists, called reading science fiction the only preventive medicine for future shock? Note Frankenstein's publication date, by the way, 1818. The science fiction bicentennial is just 5 years away. I, for one, am going to throw a party. When people talk about all the things science fiction correctly predicted, they often cite moon landings and submarines, suggested by Jules Verne, or surveillance technology, made famous by George Orwell, or the cell phone, inspired by Star Trek's handheld communicator, or robots, the very name of which comes from a work of science fiction, Karl Čapek's 1920 play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots. That said, science fiction's job is not to predict the future. Rather, it's to propose and explore a smorgasbord of possible futures so that society can make informed decisions about where we want to go. George Orwell's science fiction classic 1984 wasn't a failure because the future it predicted didn't turn out to be anything like the real year 1984. Rather, it was a resounding success because it helped us avoid that future. As Ray Bradbury famously said, "My job isn't predicting the future, it's preventing it." Still, of all the things science fiction has foretold, I think the most important one is the simple fact that there will be a future. From the advent of nuclear weapons, the exact mechanism the secret Manhattan Project had in mind was predicted in such exquisite detail in the science fiction magazine Astounding Stories that the FBI demanded a recall of one of its issues. To the Cold War and the War on Terror, to the present day as we stand on the brink of catastrophic climate change, science fiction has always said and continues to insist that humankind does have a future that stretches far ahead for hundreds, thousands, and even millions of years. This deeply held conviction that the human journey has only just begun is the most important and most wondrous prediction of all. Thank you very much. Thank you.